The sun rose pale and cold over the foothills of Montana Territory, painting the sky in soft streaks of gold and lavender. The land stretched endlessly before her, wild, untamed, and utterly indifferent to her presence. Yet Clara Dawson stood there, axe in hand, with a stubborn set to her jaw and determination burning behind her tired eyes. She had come 1,000 miles from everything she knew, all for this, an acre of rough land, a few supplies, and a promise whispered to herself on the long, lonely trail west. Just 6 months ago, she'd been a widow in a small Pennsylvania town, living in a house that suddenly felt too quiet, too full of ghosts. Her husband, Henry, had been a dreamer, a man who spoke often of the western frontier, of starting anew where land was cheap and sky stretched forever. When the fever took him, it also took her reason for staying. There was nothing left for her back east, no children, no family who understood her grief. The whispers of pity followed her wherever she went. So one morning, with only her wedding band, a horse named Molly, and a wagon of supplies, she left. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. The land she purchased wasn't much. Rocky soil near the base of a pine-covered ridge, a creek cutting through one side. The nearest town, Ash Hollow, was half a day's ride away, and the locals there had looked at her with a mix of disbelief and pity when she signed the deed. "No woman can build a cabin alone," one man had said. "You'll freeze before winter." Clara had smiled politely, though her heart had trembled a little. She'd been afraid of many things these past months, but not failure. Not anymore. Every morning since her arrival, she rose before the sun and worked until her arms shook. She chopped trees, stripped bark, and dragged the logs into a clearing she'd chosen for her home. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now calloused and blistered. Her skirts were torn, her back ached constantly, but with each log laid and each plank cut, she felt a piece of her grief fall away. This cabin was more than shelter. It was proof she could still build something, still live. Sometimes, as the wind swept down from the mountains and rustled through the tall grass, she would pause, close her eyes, and imagine Henry beside her. He would have laughed at her crooked lines and rough walls, teased her about the hammer she gripped too tightly. But he would have been proud, she knew that. "You always were the stubborn one, Clara," she could almost hear him say. The days were long and often silent, save for the creak of wood, the distant call of a hawk, and the murmuring of the creek. Nights were the hardest. When darkness fell and the coyotes howled from the hills, the weight of her loneliness pressed down like a stone. She missed conversation, the sound of another person breathing near her, the simple comfort of being seen. But she reminded herself, this was what she'd chosen. Freedom, even when it felt like exile. Her small progress became her anchor. The first day she raised a single wall felt like triumph. By the end of the week, she had 2. She learned to use tools she'd never held before, learned to read the weather by the smell of the wind. The wilderness began to accept her, or at least tolerate her presence. And yet beneath her hard resolve, a quiet yearning began to stir, one she tried not to name. She told herself she didn't need anyone. But some nights, when the fire crackled low and her eyes drifted toward the empty horizon, she couldn't help wondering if the world would ever send someone her way, not to save her, but simply to see her, unbeknownst to Clara. That answer was already riding toward her, silent and steady, on the back of a dark horse. The first weeks tested Clara Dawson in ways she had never imagined. The land, vast and beautiful in the morning light, turned cruel by noon. The sun bore down mercilessly, burning her neck and drying her lips until they cracked. The soil was hard and rocky, and every blow of the shovel seemed to mock her. Even so, Clara refused to bend. She had traded a life of quiet sorrow for one of sweat and struggle, and for all its hardship, this new life at least belonged to her. By late summer, her cabin stood half-built, 4 sturdy walls of uneven logs and a roof frame waiting for shingles. But the work came at a cost. Her hands bled daily, her back throbbed each night, and her arms were covered in bruises from hauling timbers larger than she should have dared to lift. When exhaustion threatened to undo her, she would stop, wipe the sweat from her brow, and whisper to herself, "One more beam, one more day, Her horse Molly had become her only companion, a patient brown mare with a white blaze down her nose. Clara spoke to her as though she were human, telling her about her plans for the cabin, the vegetable garden she meant to plant come spring, even about Henry, though she kept those words soft, almost ashamed to say his name aloud in the lonely air. Molly listened with calm eyes, chewing grass as if she understood every word. But the wilderness did not care for sentiment. One night, as the wind howled across the valley, Clara woke to the sound of a crash outside. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her rifle and rushed out, only to find that one of her walls had buckled under the force of the wind. All her careful work lay scattered in the mud. She stood barefoot in the rain, her nightdress plastered to her skin, staring at the ruin. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt tears sting her eyes. The next morning, she began again. Her muscles screamed in protest, but her pride would not allow her to stop. Still, doubt crept in with every failure. How long could she keep going alone? How long before the land broke her as it had broken so many others who'd come seeking freedom and found only struggle? When she managed a rare trip to Ash Hollow for supplies, she felt every eye on her. The townsfolk regarded her with a mix of pity and disbelief. The storekeeper, a kind but condescending man named Mr. Wilkins, offered to send his nephew to help around the place. Clara refused politely, knowing what he really meant. She shouldn't be living out there without a man. On the way back, with her wagon full and her heart heavy, she whispered to herself, "They'll see. I'll finish it myself." But nature had its own plans. A dry spell turned the creek to a trickle, forcing her to carry water from a spring nearly half a mile away. Molly stumbled one day on the rocky trail and came up limping. Clara tended to her gently, whispering comfort, but she knew the horse wouldn't be strong enough for long rides. That meant fewer trips to town, fewer chances to trade or ask for supplies. The loneliness deepened then, wrapping around her like the chill of early autumn. The wind began to carry the scent of pine and frost, a warning of the winter to come. She spent her evenings by the fire, mending torn clothes and planning how to seal the roof before the snows arrived. Yet beneath the weariness, something in her had begun to harden, not in bitterness, but in strength. She no longer flinched at the creak of trees in the wind or the cry of coyotes at night. She had learned the rhythm of the wild, the balance between fear and respect. Still, sometimes as she stared into the flickering firelight, she felt a pang of longing, not for comfort, but for a voice other than her own. She didn't know that miles away, a man named Luke Remington was driving a small herd across the same stretch of valley. And before long, their paths, two lonely souls surviving on sheer will, were about to cross beneath the same restless sky. The storm clouds rolled in like an army, dark, low, and heavy with rain. Clara noticed them first as a gray bruise on the horizon while she was stacking logs behind her half-finished cabin. The air grew still, thick enough to taste. Molly lifted her head, ears twitching uneasily. Clara frowned and wiped the sweat from her brow. "Not today," she muttered to the sky. She still needed a few more hours of clear weather to cover her roof with canvas before the rain hit. But the frontier had its own will. By mid-afternoon, the wind had begun to moan through the pines, carrying a scent of wet earth and ozone. Clara swung her axe faster, urgency tightening her every movement. That was when she heard it, the distant, rhythmic thud of hooves. For a moment she froze, listening. Travelers were rare this far from town. Her land was secluded, cut off from the main trail. She reached for the rifle leaning against the woodpile, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. A figure emerged slowly from the rising dust, a lone rider astride a dark bay horse. He rode with easy confidence, his posture straight but relaxed, his long duster coat flapping behind him in the wind. As he drew nearer, Clara could make out a face half hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. A man of about 35, with a strong jaw, sun-darkened skin, and eyes as still and unreadable as a winter lake. He reined in his horse a few yards from her clearing and tipped his hat slightly. "Afternoon?" "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough-edged, like gravel sliding over stone. Clara kept her rifle steady, though she tried to mask the tremor in her voice. "You're a long way off the main trail." "I know," he replied simply. His gaze flicked over the half-built cabin, the scattered tools, and the woman standing between him and her unfinished home. Lost a few head of cattle. Been tracking 'em this way. She nodded cautiously, lowering the rifle but not relaxing entirely. You won't find much grazing here. The land's rocky, I noticed. His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but it vanished as quickly as it came. The silence that followed stretched thin. The man dismounted, patted his horse, and took a slow look around as though memorizing the place. Clara felt oddly self-conscious under that quiet, measured gaze. She wasn't used to company, least of all from a stranger who said so little and seemed to see so much. You built this yourself? He asked finally. I'm building it, she corrected, pride sneaking into her tone. Ain't done yet? Looks solid. He said it like a fact, not a compliment, but it warmed her more than she cared to admit. The wind shifted suddenly, and thunder rolled across the hills. The man glanced toward the blackening sky. You'll want that roof covered before nightfall. Storm's coming fast. I know, she said, trying to sound confident. But he seemed to read the strain in her voice. He mounted up again, tugging lightly on the reins. You'll be all right? I've managed this long, she said. He gave a small nod, as if that was all the answer he needed. Name's Luke Remington, he said after a pause. I got a ranch a few miles west. If you need anything, there's a light on at the ridge. Before she could respond, he touched his hat again and turned his horse toward the open range, disappearing into the gray curtain of approaching rain. For a long while after he was gone, Clara stood rooted to the spot, staring at the spot where he'd vanished. His presence lingered like the scent of rain, quiet but impossible to ignore. When the first drops began to fall, she gathered her tools and went back to work, her heart beating strangely fast. She didn't know why the sound of his voice still echoed in her mind, or why her hands trembled as she lifted the next beam. She only knew that for the first time since she'd come to this wild land, she didn't feel entirely invisible. That night, as lightning flashed over the ridge and thunder shook the valley, Clara thought she saw a faint light flicker in the distance, just where he'd said his ranch was. And somehow, knowing he was out there made the storm feel a little less lonely. The storm came roaring down from the mountains with a fury that no prayer or preparation could withstand. By dusk, the wind was howling through the valley, tearing at the trees and shaking the half-built cabin like a toy in a child's hand. Clara had worked until her arms felt like lead, trying to fasten the canvas over the roof beams, but the gusts snatched it away again and again. She could smell the rain before it hit, sharp and metallic, and then the sky opened. The first wave of rain came slashing down sideways, cold as ice. Clara ducked under the small lean-to she'd built for her supplies, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. Lightning cracked across the sky, so close it lit the valley like daylight for a heartbeat. In that flash, she saw her walls, her hard-won, hand-built walls, shudder beneath the weight of the storm. She tried to hold them up, hammering more nails into the loosened planks. But her efforts were swallowed by the chaos of wind and thunder. Water poured through the cracks, soaking the straw she'd laid for bedding. Molly whinnied in panic from the crude corral, and Clara rushed out into the rain, slipping and stumbling through the mud to calm her. "Easy, girl, easy," she whispered, her voice trembling. She could barely hear herself over the wind. By the time she got Molly secured under a makeshift shelter of canvas and barrels, the cabin wall gave way with a sharp, splintering crack. Clara turned in time to see the logs tumble like a child's blocks. The sight tore through her like a physical blow. She had worked for months for this. Every blister, every bruise, every lonely night had been poured into those walls, and now the storm ripped them down in minutes. For a long moment, she just stood there, drenched and trembling, watching the ruin. The rain blurred her vision until she realized it wasn't just the weather, it was her tears. Something in her broke then. Something she had been holding together since the day she buried her husband. She dropped to her knees in the mud and let the grief pour out. Mingling with the storm, she cried for Henry, for the life they were supposed to have, for the foolish hope that she could rebuild it all on her own. The wind howled like a cruel reminder. You can't do this alone, and for the first time, Clara believed it. When the storm finally began to die in the early hours before dawn, she was too exhausted to move. She sat huddled beside the remains of her cabin, soaked to the bone, her body shaking with cold. The valley was eerily quiet again, except for the steady dripping of rain from the pine trees. The scent of wet earth filled the air. She dozed in and out of restless sleep until the faint sound of hooves broke through the silence. At first, she thought she was dreaming, the rhythmic thud of a horse approaching, steady and deliberate. Then she heard the soft jingle of a bridle, the creak of saddle leather. She lifted her head, blinking against the dim gray light of dawn. Through the mist came a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably familiar. Luke Remington rode up slowly, his hat pulled low, his coat dark with rain. His horse's breath steamed in the cold air. For a moment, Clara just stared, too weary to speak, too stunned to understand why he'd come. Luke dismounted without a word, taking in the wreckage with those steady, unreadable eyes. His gaze moved from the fallen logs to her mud-streaked face. He didn't ask what happened. The storm had told him enough. "You shouldn't be alone out here in weather like this," he said quietly. Clara's throat tightened. "It's my land, my home." He looked at the broken cabin, then back at her. "Then let's put it back up." She opened her mouth to protest, to tell him she didn't need his pity, but the words caught in her throat. There was no pity in his tone, only quiet conviction. Something inside her that had frozen during the storm began to thaw. Luke reached down, offering his hand. His palm was rough, calloused, warm despite the cold. For a heartbeat, Clara hesitated. Then she took it. And just like that, under the pale, rain-washed sky, a partnership began, not one of words, but of shared strength and silent understanding. By the time the morning sun broke through the thinning clouds, Clara had never felt more drained or more ashamed. Her cabin lay in ruins, her clothes were soaked, and her body ached from the cold. Luke Remington stood quietly beside the wreckage, his hat in one hand, surveying the mess with a calm she couldn't understand. He hadn't said much since arriving, just tied up his horse and started clearing debris as though the place were his own. "You don't have to do that," Clara said, her voice raw from the storm and sleepless night. "I can manage." Luke didn't look at her. "You've been managing a long time." He lifted a heavy beam, his muscles straining as he set it aside. "Doesn't mean you have to do it alone." The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Clara turned away, blinking hard against the tears that threatened to rise again. "I don't need help," she whispered. Luke finally stopped and faced her, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. His voice was quiet, steady, like the earth itself. "Didn't say you needed help?" He paused, studying her with eyes that saw more than she wished they would. Then he said it. "Need a partner?" The question hung in the air, soft but heavy with meaning. It wasn't just about the cabin, and somehow they both knew it. Clara felt the words settle deep in her chest, right where her pride lived. She wanted to refuse, to send him away like every other man who'd tried to tell her what she couldn't do. But something in Luke's tone stopped her. There was no condescension, no pity. Just quiet respect. She folded her arms, trying to steady her voice. "You don't even know me." He gave the smallest hint of a smile. "Don't have to. I can see what you're made of." They stood there in silence, the wind whispering through the wet pines. Finally, Clara sighed and glanced at the broken beams scattered around them. "If you're staying, we should start with the foundation." It shifted. Luke nodded once, then rolled up his sleeves. "You tell me where you want it. I'll lift." That day became the first of many they would spend side by side. They worked mostly without words, hauling, cutting, and setting new logs into place. Luke's movements were sure and practiced. He had the kind of strength that didn't need showing off. When Clara struggled with a stubborn beam, he stepped in silently, his hands steadying hers without taking over the task. Somehow his quiet presence didn't threaten her independence. It strengthened it. As the day wore on, she caught herself watching him. His silence wasn't awkward. It was full of understanding. He didn't fill the air with idle talk. He just worked, whistling low sometimes under his breath, focused and sure. When the sun began to dip behind the hills, they stood together looking at what they'd accomplished. Half a wall, upright and solid once more. "Looks good," Clara said softly, pride warming her chest. Luke nodded. "It'll hold this time." They built a small fire as twilight settled over the valley. The scent of pine smoke curled into the cool air, and the forest hummed quietly around them. Clara handed him a tin cup of coffee, and he accepted it with a brief nod. "You really don't talk much, do you?" she said with a faint smile. Luke's eyes glinted in the firelight. "Talking's easy. Listening's harder." She chuckled softly, surprised at how the sound felt. Light, almost unfamiliar. "And what exactly are you listening for?" He stared into the flames. "The kind of silence that don't hurt." Clara didn't answer, but her smile faded into something deeper. Understanding, maybe even peace. For the first time since Henry's death, the silence between her and another person didn't feel heavy. It felt shared. When she finally crawled into her bedroll that night, the wind had gone still. She looked up at the stars peeking through the tattered clouds and thought of Luke's question. "Need a partner?" She'd wanted to say no, but her heart, traitor that it was, had already whispered yes. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm, hard work, long hours, and a silence that wasn't lonely anymore. Luke Remington came each morning just after sunrise, his horse's hooves crunching softly through the dew, and stayed until the shadows stretched long. He never announced himself, never asked for breakfast or thanks. He just showed up, set his hat on a fence post, and started working. Clara learned his ways quickly. He was a man who measured twice and cut once, who could fix a broken tool with a handful of nails and a quiet hum. When she offered suggestions, he listened without interruption. When something went wrong, he didn't scold or sigh. He simply found a solution. His calm steadiness was as solid as the beams they raised together. In the evenings, when the day's labor was done and the firelight flickered over the growing cabin, they sometimes shared coffee and a few words. Luke wasn't a talker, but the things he said stayed with her long after he rode away. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the ridge, Clara found herself asking, "You ever build a place like this before?" Luke glanced up from the wood he was sanding. "Built one once," he said after a pause. "Didn't last. What happened?" He set the wood down, eyes distant. "Fire. Fever took my wife and boy before it burned." His tone was flat, but the words carried weight. After that, the house didn't matter much. Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to say something, something kind, something that would fill the heavy space between them, but no words felt right. So she did what he did. She listened. The silence stretched, and for the first time, it didn't feel empty. He finally looked up, meeting her gaze with quiet steadiness. "You don't have to say anything." "I wasn't going to," she said softly, and a small smile tugged at his mouth. From that moment on, something shifted between them. The grief that had been buried deep inside each of them began to feel less like a wound and more like a scar. Something healed but remembered. Luke's presence changed more than just the pace of her work. He brought a kind of peace to the land itself. He fixed the corral for Molly, repaired her water barrel, and even mended the old saddle she'd been meaning to throw away. He never made a show of kindness. He simply saw what needed doing and did it. One morning, Clara woke to find him already there, splitting wood with precise, powerful swings. She stood in the doorway watching him for a while, coffee in hand, realizing she'd come to expect him, depend on him even. That thought startled her. For months, she'd prided herself on needing no one. But when she saw Luke wipe his brow, the rising sun lighting the edge of his face, she couldn't deny what she felt, a warmth she hadn't allowed herself in years. At midday, while they worked on the new roof frame, she caught him watching her with that same quiet curiosity he'd had the first day they met. "You ever get tired of silence?" she asked. Luke adjusted a beam, his voice low and thoughtful. "Not if it's shared." Clara blinked, caught off guard by the simple truth in his words. She wanted to answer, but her throat felt tight. So she nodded and passed him a nail. They worked until dusk, their shadows stretching long over the ground. When the last beam was in place, Luke climbed down from the ladder, wiped his hands, and looked at her cabin with quiet pride. "It's coming together," he said. Clara smiled faintly. "So are we." He gave her a long look as though weighing whether to say more. Then, true to his nature, he didn't. He just smiled, small, knowing, and gone almost as soon as it appeared. That night, after he rode home, Clara stood by the window watching the moon rise over the hills. She thought about his story, about the wife and son he'd lost, and how gently he carried that sorrow. It made her own grief feel understood, shared. The silence of the valley no longer echoed. It hummed softly, like a song meant for two, and though neither of them spoke it aloud, something real had begun to grow, steady as the cabin walls they built together. The cabin was nearly finished when Clara's past came riding up the valley, uninvited, unwanted, and full of the kind of memories she had tried to bury under every log and nail. It was late afternoon, the air soft and golden. Clara was stacking firewood while Luke mended the fence near the creek. The peace of their daily rhythm had settled over the land, the chirp of crickets, the slow rustle of pine. Then the sound of hooves broke it. 2 riders came down the trail, dust trailing behind them. Clara's breath caught before she even recognized the lead horse. She knew that black stallion, and the man riding it, Matthew Dawson, her late husband's brother. He reined in sharply a few feet from her, his expression as hard and polished as she remembered. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth but cold, "you're a hard woman to find." She set down the wood slowly, every nerve in her body on edge. "I wasn't hiding," she said, though her voice wavered. "Out here alone?" Matthew's gaze swept over the cabin, the corral, and then to Luke, who had started walking up the path, silent but watchful. "Doesn't seem so alone anymore." Luke stopped beside her, saying nothing, but his quiet presence was enough to steady her. "What do you want, Matthew?" Clara asked. He dismounted, brushing the dust from his coat. "You know what I want. Henry owed me money when he died. I was patient, Clara. I gave you time. But you ran off, and I had to hire men to track you down." Her stomach twisted. She remembered those last months before Henry's death, his debts, his guilt, his promises to pay it all back once they reached the frontier. But he'd never lived long enough to make good on them. "I don't owe you a cent," she said firmly. "Whatever business you and Henry had died with him." Matthew's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That land was bought with my loan. By rights, it's mine." He nodded toward the man beside him, a rough-looking fellow with a sneer that made Clara's skin crawl. "You can pack what's yours, or we'll do it for you." Before Clara could answer, Luke stepped forward, calm and deliberate. "You'll do no such thing." Matthew turned on him, his tone sharp. "And who are you to say so?" Luke didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Man who works this land with her?" "Man who won't see her cheated." The stillness that followed was thick with tension. Matthew's eyes narrowed. "You threatening me?" Luke's expression didn't change. "Just stating fact." For a moment, Clara thought Matthew might draw his gun. But perhaps it was something in Luke's steady, unflinching stare, or the quiet confidence of a man who'd seen enough trouble not to fear it, that made him think twice. Matthew spat into the dirt instead. "This isn't over," he said, mounting up again. "You can't hold property that was never yours. I'll be back, with papers and with men who won't scare so easy." Clara watched as they rode off, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. When the sound of their horses faded, she turned to Luke, trembling. "He won't stop. He'll find a way." Luke's eyes softened, but his tone remained steady. "Then we'll be ready." She wanted to argue, to tell him not to get involved, but the words caught in her throat. He was already involved. From the moment he'd offered his hand after the storm, he had tied his fate to hers. That evening they sat on the half-finished porch as the sky blazed orange and pink. The air smelled of pine and rain. Clara stared at the horizon where Matthew had vanished. "I came out here to start over," she said quietly. "To build something that was mine. I didn't think the past would follow." Luke sipped his coffee, his gaze distant but sure. "The past always finds you," Question is, do you stand when it does? She turned to look at him. And what about you? What do you stand for, Luke? He met her eyes, the firelight reflecting in his steady gaze. For what's right, for what's worth keeping. For a long while, neither spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, and the first stars appeared overhead. Despite the fear gnawing in her chest, Clara felt a strange calm settle over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't facing her troubles alone. The days that followed Matthew Dawson's visit were filled with unease, but also with purpose. Clara and Luke worked harder than ever, driven by something deeper than determination. It wasn't just about finishing the cabin anymore. It was about claiming what was rightfully hers, what they had built together with sweat, patience, and quiet trust. Each morning, Luke arrived early, as he always did, bringing small comforts without a word. A sack of flour, a new rope for Molly, a tin of coffee. Clara pretended not to notice his small kindnesses, but each one touched her more than she let on. After weeks of fear and toil, his presence had become her anchor. Together they rebuilt what the storm had destroyed, and more. The cabin rose taller this time, sturdier, every beam set with care. Luke added little touches she hadn't planned. A window facing the sunrise, a hand-carved door frame, and a sturdy porch swing he crafted from spare timber. Clara teased him once about the swing, saying she didn't have time for sitting. He'd just shrugged and said, "You'll need a place to rest when it's all done." When they worked, they didn't need many words. They had fallen into a rhythm, understanding each other's movements as though they'd been working side by side for years. She knew when he was tired by the way his shoulders drooped, and he could tell when her hands were blistering, even when she said nothing. Sometimes their eyes met across the clearing, and in that quiet moment, the world seemed to pause. The day they drove the last nail into the final beam, Clara stepped back and stared at the cabin, her cabin, standing proud and solid under the open sky. Her chest swelled with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Luke brushed the sawdust from his hands, his expression unreadable. "It's home," he said simply. Those words lingered in the air between them. Home. Clara had dreamed of it for so long, of a place built by her own hands, where she could start again. But standing there beside Luke, she realized something she hadn't expected. A home wasn't just wood and nails. It was the people who stood beside you when everything else fell apart. As dusk fell, Luke built a fire outside the new porch, the flames dancing in the cooling air. The smell of pine smoke filled the evening. Clara brought out a pot of stew and they ate in silence, both too tired to speak. When they'd finished, Luke motioned toward the porch swing. "Try it," he said. She hesitated, then sat down. The swing creaked softly as it moved, and she couldn't help but smile. The view was breathtaking, the sun setting behind the ridge, casting the valley in gold and amber. Luke joined her, sitting at the other end of the swing, keeping a respectful distance. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them was warm, like a shared blanket. Finally, Clara broke the quiet. "You could have left, you know. After the storm, after Matthew came. You didn't have to stay." Luke stared at the horizon for a long time before answering. "Maybe I did." She turned to look at him. "Why?" His eyes met hers, steady and sure. "Because you remind me what it means to start over." "You're braver than you think, Clara." Her throat tightened. No one had ever said words like that to her, not without wanting something in return. She looked away quickly, afraid he might see too much in her eyes. "I'm not brave," she murmured. "Just too stubborn to quit," Luke smiled faintly. "That's a kind of brave." As the last light faded from the sky, Clara felt a peace she hadn't known in years settle over her. The land, the cabin, the quiet man sitting beside her, it all felt right, as if everything she'd endured had led her here. When the stars came out, she leaned back on the swing and whispered, "Thank you." Luke tilted his head slightly, his voice soft. "For what?" "For staying." He didn't answer, but his hand brushed lightly against hers on the wooden armrest. He didn't take her hand, didn't push for more. He simply let it rest there, a silent promise between two souls who had both lost and found their way again. The cabin behind them stood strong against the starlit sky, a symbol of what they had built, not just in wood and stone, but in trust and quiet love. That night, for the first time in a long time, Clara felt truly home. For a few blissful weeks, the world seemed right again. The cabin was finished, the garden had taken root, and Clara's laughter, soft and rare as spring rain, began to return. Luke stayed close, helping with the chores, riding out to mend fences or bring back supplies. Life on the edge of the wild was hard, but for the first time, Clara didn't mind the hardship. Each day ended with the same quiet ritual: supper shared by the fire, stories traded beneath the stars, and silence that felt like belonging. But peace on the frontier never lasted long. It was late one afternoon when Luke spotted dust rising on the horizon. He stiffened immediately, instinct kicking in. "Riders," he said, his voice low. Clara was kneeling by the garden, her hands covered in soil. She followed his gaze, her stomach turning cold. The sight was all too familiar. By the time the riders came into view, she recognized Matthew Dawson's black stallion leading the way, and 3 men riding behind him. They were armed. Luke's expression darkened. "Stay inside," he murmured, his hand resting on his revolver, but Clara shook her head. "This is my land, Luke. I won't hide in my own home." Matthew drew up before the cabin, his smirk confident and cruel. "I told you I'd be back," he called out. He dismounted and held up a folded paper. "Brought the law with me this time. The deed. It's mine, signed and sealed." Luke stepped forward, blocking Matthew's path. "That land was bought fair and worked honest," he said evenly. Matthew sneered. "You again. I thought maybe you were just a hired hand, but it seems you've gotten attached." His eyes slid to Clara, cruel amusement glinting there. "Didn't take you long to find another man, did it, Clara? My brother's grave isn't that cold." Clara's cheeks burned, but before she could speak, Luke's voice cut through, sharp as flint. "Watch your mouth." Matthew's men shifted uneasily, hands brushing their holsters. Tension hung thick in the air. Clara took a breath and stepped forward. "Matthew, you've no right to this land. Henry may have borrowed money from you, but I paid for this homestead myself, with the last of my savings, with my hands, with my work." He laughed. "Pretty speech. But I've got papers that say otherwise, and I've got the men to make it stick." Luke's fingers tightened around his revolver. "You'll have to go through me first." The air went still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Matthew looked from Luke to Clara and back again, his smile fading. He wasn't expecting resistance, not this kind. "You'd fight me over her?" he asked, voice low. Luke didn't answer with words. His stance said it all. For a long moment, Matthew's eyes locked on his, calculating, weighing whether the fight was worth it. Finally, he gave a cold chuckle and stepped back. "Fine," he said. "Keep your patch of dirt. But the law won't be so kind when it catches up with you." He swung into the saddle and turned his horse. "Enjoy your little dream while it lasts, Clara. It'll come crashing down soon enough." When the riders disappeared beyond the ridge, the silence left behind felt heavier than before. Clara turned to Luke, her voice trembling. "He's not finished. He'll bring someone official next time." Luke nodded grimly. "Then we'll be ready." She looked up at him, this quiet, steadfast man who'd come into her life like a storm and stayed like sunlight. Her fear began to settle, replaced by something stronger. "You don't have to fight my battles," she said softly. He met her gaze. "Maybe not. But I choose to." The simple words broke something open in her heart. She felt tears prick her eyes, not from fear this time, but from the weight of his loyalty. That night, neither of them slept much. Luke kept watch on the porch, rifle across his knees. Inside, Clara sat by the window, her candle burning low, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind in the trees, the creak of the new cabin, and the steady rhythm of Luke's footsteps outside. The peace they had built had been shaken, but not broken. And in her heart, Clara knew one thing for certain. The man who had once ridden up and asked, "Need a partner?" was no longer just a helping hand. He was her partner in every sense of the word, and together they would face whatever came next. The dawn came soft and golden after a long, restless night. A thin layer of mist clung to the valley, curling around the trees like breath on cold glass. Clara stepped out of the cabin quietly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. Luke was already there, sitting on the porch steps with his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He looked as though he hadn't slept at all, his eyes shadowed but alert. "Morning," she said softly. He turned his head, offering her a small, weary smile. "You should have stayed inside." "It's cold. I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Kept thinking about what he said about the law." Luke nodded slowly. "Men like Matthew use the law like a weapon. But he's bluffing. You built this place fair and honest. I won't let him take it from you." His words should have comforted her, but Clara's heart was heavy. "I don't want you hurt over me, Luke." He looked at her then, really looked at her, his gaze steady and full of something she hadn't dared to name. "You're worth fighting for, Clara." She felt her breath catch. There it was, plain and simple, spoken like a man who meant every word. For so long she had lived in survival mode, never allowing herself to hope for something more. But Luke's quiet strength, his unspoken kindness, had built something deeper between them than she'd ever expected. The sun began to rise over the ridge, turning the mist to gold. The cabin, their cabin now, glowed in the early light, its rough-hewn logs gleaming like polished honey. It stood as a testament to everything they had endured: storms, loneliness, loss, and now the looming shadow of Matthew's greed. Luke rose from the steps and turned to her. "We'll ride into town today," he said. "Talk to the land agent, see if we can find proof of ownership. If there's a deed, it'll be on record." Clara nodded, though fear twisted in her stomach. The thought of facing Matthew again in town, with his lies and his charm, made her tremble. But she trusted Luke. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's do it." The ride into town was long and tense. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and the silence between them was filled with unspoken thoughts. When they arrived, the small frontier settlement was already stirring, the blacksmith hammering at his forge. A few children chasing a stray dog down the main street. Inside the land office, the clerk, a balding man with spectacles, squinted at the paper Luke handed him. After a few moments of searching through dusty ledgers, he looked up. "Here it is," he said. "Filed under your husband's name, Henry Dawson. But it looks like the payment was cleared after his death, signed by Clara Dawson." Luke's eyes met Clara's. Relief washed over her so suddenly that her knees nearly gave way. "So the land's mine?" she asked, barely able to speak. The clerk nodded. "Legally, yes. You're the rightful owner." Luke smiled then, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Told you," he murmured, but the relief didn't last long. As they stepped outside, a familiar voice drawled from across the street. "Well, ain't that touching?" Matthew leaned against a post, hat tipped low, his grin sharp as a knife. "You think a little paper's gonna stop me?" Luke moved slightly in front of Clara. "It's over, Dawson. The law's clear." Matthew's expression hardened. "We'll see about that." His hand twitched toward his gun, but Luke was faster, his revolver drawn before Matthew's even cleared the holster. The street went silent. Dust swirled between them. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Matthew's lip curled, and he slowly lowered his hand. "You win this round," he spat. "But you'll regret crossing me." He mounted his horse and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Clara's whole body shook as she exhaled. Luke holstered his weapon, his expression calm but his hand trembling slightly. "It's done," he said quietly. "You're safe now." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the truth written in his eyes. This man wasn't just her protector, he was her partner, her equal. When they rode back to the cabin that evening, the sun was sinking behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. Clara stood on the porch, looking out over the land that was finally, truly hers. Luke stood beside her, silent as ever. After a long while, she turned to him. "You asked me once if I needed a partner," she said softly. "I think I do. Only now I mean it in more ways than one." Luke's eyes softened, a small smile curving his lips. "Then I reckon I'll stay." The last rays of sunlight brushed their faces as the wind rustled through the pines. The world felt new again, fresh, alive, and full of promise. Together, they stood before the cabin they had built with their own hands, two weary souls who had found not just shelter, but love. And as the morning gave way to day, their promise to build, to protect, to belong shone brighter than the rising sun.